Hello, everybody. I'm Andrew Sussman, COO of the Institute for Advertising Ethics, the IAE. The IAE is an educational nonprofit that administers the ethics certification for advertising professionals. Anyone who reads the advertising trades understands how lapses in ethical due diligence can devastate companies, careers, and people. People are increasingly conscious of misinformation's negative impacts on us, especially greenwashing. Just last month, Merriam-Webster declared the word greenwashing an official part of the English language by adding it to the dictionary for the first time. Greenwashing practices are now so pervasive and problematic that consumers themselves have named them. The good news is that we live in the kind of time known throughout history to bring systemic change. The tectonic plates of our industry are shifting. New coalitions, new types of companies, new intellectual alliances, a new process, and a new deal with the consumer and government are possible and in progress. Self-regulatory history shows that rectifying systemic harm requires a nonpartisan platform with all the players, market participants, government, and civil society. The IAE unifies corporations like P&G, Havas, and Trade Desk with government, universities, and civil society. The IAE seeks to build a foundation of knowledge and a community of practice. We are excited for our symposium on greenwashing and affront to IAE Principle 1 regarding truthfulness and high ethical standards in serving the public. Today, we're proud to be able to host Dr. Richards and this distinguished and diverse panel. Dr. Jeff Richards, JD, PhD, is a professor in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations at Michigan State University and previously served as department chairman at the University of Texas. Dr. Richards' research includes advertising regulatory issues. He has published more than 80 articles, books, and chapters, including the seminal work, Deceptive Advertising, a behavioral approach to a legal concept highly apropos today. Christina Rena is founder and CEO of the award-winning production company Generous Films, which produces climate and social impact content for brands and organizations. For over a decade, she has worked closely with researchers, scientists, and journalists to track the greenwashing and misinformation problems, and recently served as a witness at the congressional hearing on PR and climate obstruction. Dr. Benjamin Franta is a senior research fellow at the University of Oxford and the head of the Oxford Climate Litigation Lab. He is a licensed attorney in the state of California and holds PhDs in history and applied physics from Stanford and Harvard universities. Sarah Ivey is a chief strategy officer in North America for Havas Media Group, and Schmucker is AI researcher and project manager at Stuttgart Media University and serves in marketing at Mercedes-Benz AG, as well as an IAE certified ethical advertising executive. And now to Dr. Richards.
Hi, I'm Jeff Richards, and I was asked to moderate this not because of any expertise, particularly in greenwashing, but because of my experience in deceptive advertising and marketing and public relations, which I've been doing since my dissertation 30-some years ago. Let me begin by reading just a short bit from a news report that was published by Reuters Wire Service on September 14th, just over a month ago. Public relations firms go beyond their traditional task of marketing to help their oil and gas clients fight off climate policies and mislead the public about climate change, U.S. congressional Democrats said at a hearing on Wednesday. The House Natural Resources Committee's oversight panel, led by U.S. Representative Katie Porter of California, held a hearing about the role of public relations firms in preventing climate action and released a report detailing deceptive and misleading tactics they use for their client campaigns. And it goes on to say, the committee on Wednesday released a memo showing that oil majors like ExxonMobil Corporation, Shell, BP, and Chevron Corporation greenwashed their record on climate change through deceptive advertising and climate pledges without meaningfully reducing emissions. I think that sort of sets the stage for our discussion today. Greenwashing is a hot topic and a concern within the ethical principles, as you were just told. Our session today is intended to start a discussion about it and what it means for advertising and public relations practice. Greenwashing certainly affects far more than just oil and gas industries, but given the recent congressional hearings, this seems like a logical place to begin that discussion. We're going to start with Ben Franta, who is Senior Research Fellow of the head of Climate Litigation Lab at Oxford University. Ben will provide some fundamental pieces to help us all understand why we're here. Ben?
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you everyone for being here. You know, I'm a lawyer, I'm an academic as well. I run a group at the University of Oxford that focuses on climate litigation, and we do research that helps inform climate litigation. And a big area that a lot of lawyers, as well as other groups, are interested in now is greenwashing litigation. And so I just want to provide a short, simple overview of what the legal landscape is like for greenwashing. I just want to talk about three things. First, what is greenwashing? What are some of the governing laws and legal trends that we see in this area? And then some simple recommendations. And I really want this to be food for thought, for discussion and the beginning of a discussion, rather than the end of one or anything like that. So first, what is greenwashing? And a Canadian lawyer recently wrote a great report about this topic, and I thought he summed it up well. He says, greenwashing happens when an entity falsely or misleadingly claims that its activities, products, or services have certain environmental attributes. And it's a really broad concept, and it involves both factual misstatements, but also misleading statements. And it can include statements to do with the company's activities, but also the products it sells and so on. So, for example, you might have seen companies like ExxonMobil advertising its biofuels research, or this is another one from Chevron, portraying the company as a leader in renewable energy. This is another one from BP, doing the same thing. And what's the problem with this? Isn't it good to support renewable energy? It's a reasonable question to ask. So the problem can arise when consumers get a misleading impression about the activities of the company. So, for example, this is a recent research result reported in the Financial Times, and what it does is it tallies the capital investments of various fossil fuel companies in renewable energy from 2010 to 2018. So these are annual averages. And so if we look at a company like ExxonMobil, that's around the middle of this table here, and we see that it spent about 0.2% of its capital investments over that time period in low carbon energy sources, and the remaining 99.8% in more fossil fuels. So that's when we see a mismatch between what a company is actually doing and the way it's portraying itself. And that's the sort of mismatch that can give rise to potential liability through litigation. Today there was some big news along these lines. HSBC was ordered or asked to take down a bunch of its ads. It had ads like this up. It says climate change doesn't do borders. So in the UK, we're helping to plant 2 million trees, which will lock in 1.25 million tons of carbon over their lifetime. It sounds great, but what it omits is that HSBC is also investing a lot in more fossil fuel production. So that's an omission to do with the overall activities of the company. A complaint was brought with the Advertising Standards Authority, which is a industry body rather than a court, and that body decided that this was a misleading ad, and they asked HSBC to take them down. That was just today or maybe yesterday, but very recent. That's just a great example. So again, the point I want to make is that greenwashing encompasses or can encompass a wide range of activities, from the way that products are described, maybe describing natural gas as clean. I think maybe we've all seen that. That's been out there. Sustainable fuels that are actually not sustainable. Characteristics of certain activities like flying as carbon neutral or net zero or Paris aligned, when in fact they're not, or even exaggerations, exaggerating the scale of carbon capture activities by a company, for example, or the impact of carbon offsets, or talking about carbon emission reductions and ignoring methane emissions, which of course is a carbon molecule and a greenhouse gas. So those are all just examples. It can apply to a wide variety of activities. We've also seen in the research community that this is a very prevalent activity. A recent study found that over a third, or about 30% or so, of the Forbes 2000 firms have committed to net zero by 2050, which is great, but about half of them intend to rely on carbon offsets to do this, and almost all carbon offsets are actually not removing carbon from the atmosphere, but they're things like temporarily delaying logging in a certain area or something like that. So again, consumers can get a misleading impression as to what this actually means. Again, just carbon offsets are often temporary. That's just another example to do with offsets. As was mentioned earlier, we were discussing this a bit earlier, these claims matter. They matter to consumers, they matter to investors. This is another study in Canada finding that a third of consumers are willing to pay more for more sustainable products. So it is impacting consumer decisions, it's material in a legal sense. And investors also look at this when they're evaluating whether a company is climate proof and so on. So these matter, they're prevalent, and this is an area that's growing. So just very quickly, what's some of the governing law and legal trends on this? This is an example of some of the statutory language that governs some greenwashing claims. This is just from Quebec, and I just use this because it's a pretty representative example. It says, no merchant, manufacturer, or advertiser may, by any means whatever, make false or misleading representations to a consumer. So very broad. A lot of things can fall under that, and it can include things that are factually false, but also, and maybe more important, it can include things that are factually true, but nonetheless misleading to a typical consumer because of omissions, because of misleading emphasis, because of misleading context or vague or ambiguous formulation. So those are ways that merchants and potentially also the firms that help them create those messages can face liability risk. And the point is, if you remember one thing, I think from what I'm saying, is that what are called weasel words often, they're not an escape. Just because something is narrowly true or narrowly factually true does not, it's not an out, doesn't, that's not an escape from potential liability, because the law emphasizes misleading, not just factually false. As far as what can happen in terms of remedies, if greenwashing is found, there can be civil remedies like money penalties, like, so much money per violation, and a violation often is tallied by every time a consumer sees that impression. That's one violation. So those can add up very quickly. They often don't require what's called scienter in law, which is knowledge of wrongdoing. So even if it's an accident, there can still be liability found There can be administrative remedies like having to prove up the truthfulness of an ad, or there can also be things designed to be punishments like punitive fines. Plaintiffs can bring actions direct against a violator. For example, Massachusetts Attorney General bringing these sorts of claims against ExxonMobil. Just today or yesterday, state of New Jersey brought a very similar suit against various fossil fuel companies. Complaints to consumer protection agencies, asking those agencies to enforce. We see this lately in Canada, and complaints to non-governmental adjudicative bodies like this Advertising Standards Authority with these HSBC ads that we saw today. These suits are growing in number. At least 20 of them have been filed before, these various courts in these various countries since 2016, and almost 30, and perhaps more by now, have been filed before these non-court entities in various countries as well. And it's part of this exponential growth in climate litigation that we're seeing worldwide in general. Of the 2,000 climate-related lawsuits ever filed, about a quarter of them were filed in the last 2 years alone. So that gives an idea of how this is a really rapidly expanding area. This is just a map of some of where these suits are located. A bunch in the United States, of course, many in Europe, but also in countries like Brazil. There are some in India as well, and other countries too. So it's a global phenomenon. And just to close off, what can we conclude? Well, climate washing or greenwashing applied to climate change, it's already illegal now. It's already subject to laws that already exist, and it exposes those who engage in it to various risks, reputational risk, as well as direct legal risk. And it's coming under greater scrutiny. And as we saw, some of these complaints have been successful, so I would expect to see more of them. What to remember from this? Be aware of the breadth of consumer protection laws. They're very broad. And although advertisers and strategists to industries are not selling products to a consumer, not consumer-facing merchants, they're not immune from liability necessarily. And we saw this with opioid litigation with McKinsey strategists. And finally, avoid this micro-truth, macro-lie sort of formulation of statements, things that are narrowly true but can still be misleading, can still lead to liability. So that's just want to kind of lay the landscape out, and I'll leave it at that. And thank you. I look forward to hearing the others.
Thank you, Ben. Let's go next to Christine Arena. Christine is founder of Generous Films production company, but importantly for our discussion today, she's a former executive vice president of Edelman, which is the largest public relations agency in the world. Christine?
Yes, I think we were going to ask about the recent House hearings that just occurred. For those who don't know, for 10 years, I've worked with researchers, climate scientists, social scientists, investigative journalists, and others to try to help track the escalating greenwash and climate disinformation problems, and then try to message the findings back to our industry and to the public, which is why I was asked to testify at the recent House hearings, looking at PR firms and their role in enabling climate obstruction. The reason there is so much activity, aside from the litigation activity, there are two ongoing congressional investigations, one led by the Oversight Committee looking at climate disinformation, the fossil fuel industry's history of denying climate science, falsely suggesting that it has the solutions to climate change. The hearing where I testified and appeared as a witness was again focused on the role of PR firms. I was the only witness to give testimony, and that was not by design. That was because no other public relations executives who were invited to speak before the American public and Congress on this issue agreed to participate. So that sort of no comment from our industry has been fairly consistent over the past 5 years, and that's actually feeds into this intensifying scrutiny that we're facing I will just say, Dr. Richards, if you don't mind, some of the key points I brought up during the hearing are threefold. Again, as someone who has looked at this for some time now, I tried my best to translate the latest social science research back to the committee. My written statement is 5,000 words. I wrote that every bit as much as a briefing document for our industry, the public relations and advertising industry, in which I work, as I did for members of the committee. The second goal as a witness that I had was to help to identify some of the worst practices that are most prevalent, that play the dominant role in obstructing climate action. Those include greenwashing that Ben just touched on, which is an extremely widespread problem, right? Almost every agency representing high carbon clients or fossil fuel clients has engaged in some form of greenwashing. So this is an incredibly widespread problem. But we also focused on disinformation practices that play a direct role in interfering with climate policy, both on the local level. We talked about Colorado a lot during the hearing, as well as on the national level. And again, this is important because according to a Harvard study, obstruction activities, including from PR firms, have effectively set climate policy back in this country and globally by several decades. And that is why the IPCC report this year, for the first time, zoned in on rhetoric and advertising as playing into that climate obstruction game, which is something that really should set most CEOs back to have a moment of pause. So the disinformation practices I touched on include third-party mobilization efforts, which is, for example, astroturfing, the creation of fake front groups, the hiring of fake protesters and proxies that are meant to simulate community support for a corporate position. Again, it's a false appearance of support for that corporate position, and where the funding behind those activities is typically concealed. And then we also talked about delegitimization of the opposition strategies, including efforts to monitor, surveil, intimidate, harass opposition to fossil fuel industry interests. We can see this happening with SLAPP suits. We can see this happening with the attacks on climate scientists, the attacks on researchers. And so the committee was very interested in the firms that engaged in those two prongs. So again, greenwashing, very widespread, but some of the disinformation practices we're seeing are not so widespread. And so part of my goal as a witness was to express that to the committee, to acknowledge that fact. And it's important for our industry to acknowledge that as well. Some of the worst practices are coming from a minority of firms that do not represent the majority values of our industry. So that was a point that I really tried to make. And I do think overall, just taking a step back, looking at the litigation activity that Ben just outlined, the two hearings, the media flurry on this, a lot of activist efforts on this, clearly this is a time for our industry to come together, align, and draw very clear boundaries in terms of what we do and what we do not stand for.
Next, we'll go to, how about Ann Schmucker? Ann is from Mercedes-Benz. Ann, what can you add to this?
Yeah, of course, I'm entering dangerous territory because, of course, the automotive industry has a clearly visible carbon footprint. Of course, the products, at least the combustion engines. And speaking of this industry, of course, we're currently in a transition phase, which means by 2030, at least speaking for Mercedes, it is the century of EV vehicles only, which means, of course, we need to build transparency. We should not mislead, because, of course, vehicles with combustion engines are obviously not adding any positive impact on the climate footprint, carbon footprint, but at least here it's very important to be transparent. I guess this is also the first step towards a trustful communication. So transparency will build trust, and this again will, is actually providing actually a positive effect on the whole civil society, I would say. I guess we should, from an industry perspective, we should not only see it as a marketing and communication topic. It should be an integral part of the entire business strategy, business goals, and then of course the business measures. And then the measures, of course, in communication is which content do we provide, which message do we want to send out. And here again, if we combine transparency, so if we really have this provide a green proofing instead of a greenwashing, I guess this is kind of the game changer here. Yeah. I can totally agree to what Christine and Ben just outlined. If we do face also, or if we do have partners like agencies, but then also regulatory bodies supporting the industry and, you know, giving strict boundaries, but then also supportive boundaries when it comes to the communication strategy. And if there's an alignment on what we want to, what is kind of a no-go and a go, I guess we're on a good track here. I mean, speaking, I'm here now located in Europe. There's also the European Commission, of course. They have just signed this Green Deal, which means, of course, also from a regulatory side, of course, industry, all industries are asked, or not only asked, in a way also forced to prove their climate positive, climate neutral, but of course would be better climate positive strategy overall.
You're on mute, Jeff.
Sorry. Okay, we'll go to Sarah. And Sarah is from Havas Media. If you're not familiar with Havas, Havas is an enormous marketing communications firm. Sarah, you can tell them exactly what Havas is, if you will.
Awesome. Okay, Jeff, thank you very much, guys. It's very I'm honored to be part of this panel with such distinguished thinkers in the space. And I come to you as a sort of a humble advertising agency person. Havas is one of the larger global agencies, and I represent the media side, which is a little bit different than the creative side, which is where most of the conversation has been around this topic, including public relations as well. So when we look at particular examples, and I watched some of the congressional hearing that Christine was brave enough to withstand, right? It's enough to turn your hair white, literally. There are some really egregious examples of greenwashing. And what I want to talk about today, and I guess where my focus is leading the strategic part of our organization, is that there is a very murky area that is a little bit beyond greenwashing, where the slopes are very slippery. Okay, so when it comes to consumers making environmental choices and trying to make better environmental choices, as long as the cost isn't too high, and I think we always need to keep that in mind, because we're going into a recessionary, inflationary environment, as that costs are going to be a factor. People will always want to make that choice, right? And what we're seeing, of course, in consumer behavior is the culture of cancel culture, calling companies out, right? There's a very strong perspective in that. It isn't about the consumers, it's actually about what happens in the agency relationship between clients and the people who manage their businesses. So that's where I think a lot of the murkiness lies. And actually, Ben, thank you for that HSBC example, because I'm going to pick on that one just to show you what I mean. So HSBC brought to their agency, who has a long, long history of doing a beautiful campaign, right? That campaign is beautiful. It's all about building their brand. They've been successful at it for over 30 years. They brought them a brief that said, we've got some great news. Can you imagine this poor marketing person? I finally got some great news to talk about, right? So they craft this beautiful brief. They hand it off to their agency. The agency goes, wonderful. We have an outdoor campaign that we're already planning, blah, blah, blah. At no point in time did that person who was managing the account ask them if there was any reason why they couldn't go to market with that message. It's a great message. Why wouldn't you want that, right? So that's sort of that dynamic, right? Marketers are delighted when they have great news. They're actually encouraged to emphasize the best part of their product. And in many cases, some of these marketers for whom have been in their jobs less than 2 years, that's an average tenure, right? Are coming at this saying, oh, this is the best thing I can say about my product. But the critical thinking, right, is not there. So the two things that I would like to see happen across the industry, number one, is better critical thinking on both sides, both agency and marketer, right? And number two, encourage the culture to have a difficult conversation. And this is where the IAE is really, really helpful. If you've done the certification, good for you. If you haven't and you're in this industry, you should, because that's one of the principal tenets, is creating a culture where you can have this conversation, right? It's one of those soft skills that we need to teach everyone in the business, from super junior people to senior people, is to have this conversation. And the fact of the matter is, when you go into market with anything that is sustainable, anything that is gender equality, anything that touches upon deep and abiding social issues like women's health in the United States, we need to treat those messages and those campaigns with a much higher level of scrutiny and circumspection, and to be able to create that culture around those briefs and those campaigns that actually open up conversation around. So Ben, just a quick note, HSBC, that particular campaign, RBC is about to actually encounter the exact same thing, because RBC is one of the largest banks in the world, right? But they're about to be caught out because they've also been funding fossil fuels. It's one of those things where people just haven't got that muscle memory yet. So as agency people, I think we need to lead from the front. I think we need to invest, and that's something, that's why we're here as part of this panel, is that we've had this relationship. Havas has had this relationship with IAE for some time now, but we've also invested in something called meaningful media. Today, we're launching the meaningful social metrics, which is basically a way for us to use the data that we have to look at carbon footprint, social impact, things like that, to help clients make better choices, even when it comes to running in media. So I'm anxious to see change happen, and I'm just really glad that we're working on this so intently. So back to you, Jeff.
I'm fascinated with some of the things that have been said here. I think, let me go backwards here and start with Sarah. Sarah's talking about us leading from the front. And it's interesting that even though we've got all these different perspectives that have been presented so far, there's not a lot of disagreement among the speakers. What do you think, Sarah, in terms of, you pointed out how it's possible for this to be basically just about a company wanting to put its best foot forward, that there's not really an intent to try to mislead someone in that case. To what extent, though, would there be companies out there that would disagree with our positions collectively here, that think that attempts to regulate greenwashing really are bad? Is there a lot of disagreement?
I wouldn't say there's actually much disagreement, except I think in the fossil fuel industry, based on what I saw in the hearing. When I say it was enough to turn your hair white, it really was enough to turn your hair white in terms of aggressive tactics to be able to turn around the political agenda. And in the bulk of the traditional sort of advertising creative and advertising media industry, there's a lot of willingness to win. So, for example, I was in a workshop a couple of weeks ago. We were looking at a liquor brand that has sustainability as part of its key tenets. There was all the will in the world to do that correctly, but we needed to look at how they were actually going to market, and even silly things like how they were producing content and how they were creating events, to make sure that every step along the way, the brand behaved and always made the better choice when it came to sustainability. I truly believe that most of the industry believes that this is, because they hear it from the consumers. Like I said, the consumer case is clear. It's not as if Unilever looked at their stuff and said, people really don't care about water usage. They do, right? Which is why they're continuing to invest in things like, for example, P&G Ventures about 3 years ago was looking at was looking at how to produce all of their products in sort of little tabs rather than full water samples to be able to minimize water usage. So, and likewise on the automotive industry, the automotive industry is making a lot of strides, but it's really hard to turn around something that is fundamentally, and cars are a great example, right? Things like packaging and stuff like that. We've built a lot of these industries not based on sustainability. So to be able to turn those around, it literally is turning around the Queen Mary, right? And that's why the change is slower than we would like it to happen.
So Anne, tell us, how hard is it for a car company to do this?
I would say we have already kind of reached the peak, let's say. Yeah, we're already good on track. I guess the last years have been challenging here, but now there's a clear strategy. I can speak of the major OEMs here. They have not only forced by, let's say, regulatory authorities or the civil societies. I guess there's, of course, maybe Tesla was one of the initiator here. So they aligned their strategy. And I guess if you have a clear strategy and you are investing and really pushing this strategy for EV vehicles only, it is a good message you can send out because it's a truth message, right? So we have the transparency here because, of course, once we enter in the field where we can really speak high, we will only sell emission-free products. We're good to go. Of course, we should also have the supply chain following the same strategy here, right? But yeah, to sum it up, I can only, so what I'm like in the digital marketing field, of course, it's a difficult territory somehow, because of course you have always this boomerang effect. Promoting vehicles, there are still, not emission free. But then of course, entering now in the future strategic approach, we're good to go. It has been challenging. It's still challenging, of course, but we see like really flashlight at the end of this transition phase tunnel.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Christine, I heard you use the terms both disinformation and misinformation. Is that the same thing, or is there a difference?
No, there's a difference. And actually, this is an important point, that there is science behind the term, the phrase greenwashing, how to evaluate it, how to measure it, how to classify it, how to guard against it. The social science community has provided us with peer-reviewed frameworks. We as an industry need to use them. There is a difference between greenwashing, which is about the production of false positive perception of a company or a brand's environmental performance, and misinformation, which in the context of environmental communications or climate communications is information that runs contrary to established science or fact. Now, in the case of misinformation, that information is false, is spread by individuals who may be predisposed to certain cognitive biases, but are not necessarily deliberately spreading that information in order to confuse people. When we use disinformation with a D, we are talking about information that runs contrary to science or fact that is deliberately spread in order to mislead and for profit or political gain. So there are defined definitions, there are frameworks for evaluating disinformation, misinformation, and greenwash, and we need to use them. The one other thing I will just say, Dr. Richards, is that it's very important for the agency world to understand that greenwashing exists on a spectrum. At the low end of the spectrum, there's slight exaggerations between words and actions, and maybe companies and brands want to get credit for their green initiatives, and we appreciate that. We want them to get that credit. But on the high end of the spectrum, what Ben is zeroing in on, and Ben, I'm hoping you're going to help me out here, is where you have egregious gaps between words and actions, or green claims made and green investments in green technologies, and as well as lobbying behaviors. When we see these very wide gaps between perception and reality, and when we see concerted efforts to use misleading rhetoric as well as systematically minimize product risks, that is when greenwashing borders on fraud. And so I think, the industry would gain a lot by using those established social science frameworks. And I would love for Ben to offer his 2 cents here.
Okay, Ben, she's teed you up here. There certainly are a lot of laws that come into play here, and you've touched on some of those and some of the differences. I will point out that there is a major difference between the law of fraud, which typically requires intent to mislead, and the law of deception or misrepresentation, which typically don't require intent, which I think is certainly an important distinction. But if I am a regulator and I'm looking to try to cut down on greenwashing, where do I start in all this, Ben?
Well, it's a good question. I think, I think the first thing that's helpful to do is get a handle on how widespread this is. And it's very widespread. I can tell you that as a researcher who's been in this space for, at least 6 years. I just did a PhD in history that focused on a lot of this. And there are many advertisers who are engaging in this, groups like the New York Times, which has an advertising arm, they're promoting ads by major fossil fuel companies, promoting an image that these companies are, clean energy leaders, that they're leaders in biofuels, for example. So on a factual level, we're seeing some material misrepresentations. Now, how that gets translated into legal action, that's somewhat a live issue, that's somewhat to be determined. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the translation of that fact research, that much of which is, some years old, being translated into legal action using effective legal strategy to actually address that and intervene in that in real time. So, we'll see what the most effective strategies are. As I mentioned, there are a number, there are plaintiffs suing companies directly. There are other groups going through regulatory agencies. But one thing I want to mention is sometimes when we talk about greenwashing, there's a sort of reaction that, hey, isn't this just puffery? Isn't this just mere puffery? Like, if you go to a deli and it says better than your mom's, better soup than what your mom makes. And you say, that's not true, actually, that's wrong. Or like, best soup in the universe or something. That's puffery. That's a statement that is not meant to be taken as literally true. And that doesn't fall within this, but this is something else. This is something different. These are messages that are intended to be taken as true by consumers and ultimately to influence their decision making. For example, airlines advertising their flights as, carbon neutral or things like that. So, I just kind of wanted to mention that we're seeing just a lot more scrutiny on these sorts of messages that maybe 10 years ago might have kind of flown under the radar as like, well, they're just saying that, but you can't just say that unless it's actually substantiated, unless it's actually true and not misleading. And so, that's the territory we're entering into now.
Very good. This time is going faster than I expected, but Christine, I want to go back to you briefly. You made the point that for all of the PR agencies representing oil and gas interests, they're out there basically participating in greenwashing. And yet later you made the point that it's a minority of PR agencies that are engaged in this. Would you clarify this a little bit?
Yes. Greenwashing is an extremely widespread problem. So when we talk about greenwashing, there are a large number of agencies representing high carbon or high methane clients like oil and gas that have engaged in greenwashing and that still engage in greenwashing today. So that is a very widespread practice. The disinformation practices that we touched on during the hearing, including those astroturfing third-party mobilization efforts, including delegitimization of the opposition efforts, those are the most dangerous practices that our industry engages in. Those are deceptive marketing practices. We classify them as disinformation because they are purposely deceptive. They are meant to confuse people. They're meant to simulate false support for a position or to intimidate or harass or discredit individuals. And so those are the activities where we see a minority of firms engaging in very in behaviors and marketing. Well, I wouldn't even consider them marketing. They're not really marketing practices, but engaging in practices that have a real impact on climate action locally, including, you know, whether it's a local ballot initiative or whether it's something that plays out on a national scale. And the important thing to clarify also is that those disinformation practices are not being used in order to sell products or promote products or burnish a corporate reputation. They are being used specifically to interfere in matters of policy. And that is an important distinction. Again, this is why members of the committee are rightfully concerned, because certain PR firms are playing this disproportional role in dictating, you know, and helping to sway policy decisions or policy inaction in this case. And so I think that is something that the industry needs to confront directly. So far, most people have not wanted to comment. There is a reason why I was the only one as only witness. And most times when the media, journalist calls up an agency that has those deep connections, they get a no comment. So I think we have to start to draw those lines in the sand. So I hope that's clear. Greenwash, very widespread, disinformation, more concentrated issue.
Excellent. We have a question, it looks like it's from Russell Foxley. It's a question for Sarah. Says there's a legal requirement for agencies to ensure advertisements are correct. We see this around alcohol brands, product performance, etc. Why has this precedent not been carried over to ethical claims? It seems like an easy framework to apply.
You know, Russell, thank you for your question, because that was part of my discussion earlier, is that there isn't a legal requirement for agencies to follow the and we'll use greenwashing as an example, but it could also be gender equity claims. It could be all kinds of stuff. There isn't actually an ethical framework. There are ethical frameworks out there. So in our case, we've been working with Scope 3 ethical frameworks on greenwashing. We've also been working with the Conscious Ad Network. We've also worked with, what's the other one? Sorry, escapes me now. We're actually a B Corp, right? So there are various ways to sort of measure your progress in this, and they're great, right? But that's largely at the behest of the agencies who want to do better work and who want to guide clients into better choices. However, I would say that all the frameworks in the world, and that includes legal precedent, is no substitute for the culture of critical thinking, which is why I was suggesting before that whenever we encounter a brief that touches upon these concerns, they actually command a higher standard of care, because I just don't think there's any way around getting tougher on the scrutiny of how that whole thing comes together. Does that answer your question?
I think that's a good stab at that, Sarah. We've got another question here, and only a couple of minutes, but I need to throw this one open, I think, to any of you. It asks, apart from governments and corporations, what role can consumers play to limit greenwashing? So put the consumers in there. What can they do? Hard question, huh?
No, actually, I would love to hear from Sarah and Anne on this one.
I think consumers are pretty good at opening up their mouths, right? I mean, I have a visual in my head, and this is sort of prompted from Ben's example, right? There's a woman who stands in front of the RBC office in Toronto with her hand held in the air like this, and she stands there for a couple hours. She's a member of the First Nations, but she's using this power in her voice to call attention to the fact, and this, this is very close to our hearts in here in Canada, is that the mineral rights and the oil rights have been exploited, and they're being funded by the RBC. Right. And this is her way, but she's also using, of course, social media magnifies everything. Right. So I feel like the ability for consumer voices to be heard are bigger than ever. That's why the misinformation and the disinformation piece is so important, because people will do the right thing if they have the right data. I don't know. And what do you think?
Yeah, I can only agree. I would add another point, I guess, from my perspective, consumers should also educate him or herself. Speaking of critical thinking, right? But then, of course, they need the data in order to be informed or to get informed. So there again, we need transparency from a company side, be it high or low involvement products. Every consumer should question products. And if there is not enough information when it comes to the sustainability of any company, any industry, any product, they may deselect or select the product. So that's my perspective here. Limiting greenwashing in a way directly, I guess, no. Indirectly, yes, when it comes to consuming.
Okay, it's almost time to move out of here, but I did want to add just a couple of thoughts. I think going back to Christine and pushing the idea of using the data, one of the problems we have with greenwashing, I think, is that there's not been enough research. There is research out there being done, but not enough. And part of that is because money speaks, and you're not putting enough money into the research. There needs to be some money put into doing these studies. And let's face it, the corporations that are participating in greenwashing are the ones that have the money, not the organizations that are trying to speak up against it, or the consumers individually. So I think that's important. But one of the things that seems to be a running thread through all of what we've heard today is the fact that good ethics is good business, that there is an advantage to companies like Mercedes-Benz, and certainly there would be to oil and gas companies to be more transparent in what they're talking about. And they can still, in being transparent, talk about their good acts without implying that they're doing more than they're doing. I think at this point I should turn it over to Andrew then.
Andrew, may I just say one thing, and that is in regard to consumers. Consumers have tremendous power now to go online and to really discuss this issue, and I'm sure they do. We know that 80% of consumers go online to talk about something they don't like from a company. And so I think we'll see more consumers doing this and going on. And it's really important for us now to take this opportunity to really do the right thing. Ethics rises above the law often.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, before Andrew, I just wanted to say one thing regarding the research. There are over 300 studies on climate disinformation, misinformation, and greenwash published. I reference a number of them in my written testimony. I would encourage people to read them. We do not suffer from a lack of data. There is an abundance of social science research, and this is a fast-growing area. A lot of activity around ongoing research from Harvard, Brown, Rutgers, George Mason. We've got the IPCC report. We also have basically research organizations monitoring media trends. So we can look at ad buys, we can look at misleading messaging, how it's being amplified. We look at bot activity. So there is a great deal of rich information in addition to efforts to document and sort of catalog years of ads. And so I just want everyone in the ad industry to understand that there is an abundance of evidence on this, and there are the social science frameworks. So I'll just leave it there and let's go to Andrew.
Thank you. This is what Wally calls accurately consumer information power. Consumers have more information power than they've ever had, including organizing themselves, making their voices heard, and directing their spending. So thanks for that. And thanks, Wally, and thanks, Linda. In December, the IAE will follow up with the second symposium, which is focused on delivering the tools and the process for practitioners to do advertising without greenwashing. Everyone on the call will be re-invited. And if you're interested in helping IAE to build these new tools and new curricula, and don't hesitate to contact us on our website, iaeethics.org. We are looking for grapplers, such as some of those people on this call who are in business and who are real world professionals and who sense that something is wrong with the overall system and are willing to step up and help grapple with these issues in a nonpartisan context, which is our context. So thank you again to Dr. Richards. Thanks to Ollie and Linda. Thanks to our panelists and everyone on this call for your attention. And we look forward to the opportunity of working with everyone. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.